On this lecture, I was asked to discuss the contributions of Wyckoff, Stanlaws, Evans, Andrews, and also what did the very successful Wyckoff student do that others may not be doing. Okay, let's start back in the beginning, because our experience as a firm reaches clear back into the 1880s and the 1890s. And you have to remember that the market then was a much smaller affair, much more of a professional affair, highly dominated by a relatively few interests, such as the William Rockefeller and his allies, J.P. Morgan, and other banking interests. The bucket shops were in operation for those with relatively small amounts of money. The manipulation was much more clearly visible. All that has happened is the manipulation has changed forms over the years. Wyckoff went to work in the New York stock market as a very young man and worked his way up to where he owned his own brokerage firm. He established his own market letter, published the first financial magazine in the country, which became the Magazine of Wall Street, and during the time that he had that magazine, it was a very prestigious financial news magazine. He ran an excellent advisory service, and as I understand it, during the 1920s, he set up the finest stock market analytical staff in New York. Now, this background that I'm passing on to you came to me from quite a number of sources. The most important of them was Bob Evans, and Bob Evans raised me from a pup. However, there are other sources, some of whom are students, some of whom are staff members, such as Ellis Liu, who knew Bob Stanlaws, and also Shigeo Oshita, who studied under Stanlaws and Evans, and got rather well acquainted in New York, and many students, in addition, because I used to ask the old-timers who would come in what they remembered and the techniques that they were taught, particularly if they were acquainted with either Richard D. Wyckoff or Bob Stanlaws. And I've asked many successful students what are the techniques that they have used, and have tested these myself. And I have probably made all of the mistakes that it is possible to make, at least once, and quite often the lessons have had to be learned more than once. Okay, let's go back to Wyckoff. Anyway, during the 1920s, Wyckoff had his magazine, his brokerage firm, his advisory service, and the analytical staff, and his own personal investments, and he was quite well acquainted with the more prominent stock operators. He had either handled transactions or knew people like King, Baruch, Livermore, and so forth. And then he got involved in an operation that he probably should not have in retrospect. As a result of his brokerage house floating an issue of stock in Emerson Radio, Wyckoff eventually moved in as general manager to straighten out a very bad managerial and operational situation. He was also having some domestic problems, and as a result of the combined pressures, his health broke in 1926. And as a result of the legal problems involved in the Emerson situation, he had placed his stock in the Magazine of Wall Street in the hands of his wife, and this was his second wife, incidentally. His first wife died, and I do not know anything about her, except that apparently they did not have any children. However, he then later on married his secretary, who had acquired part of the ownership of the firm, and to protect the Magazine of Wall Street, he put all of the stock in the hands of this second wife. Now, I've been told that his doctors finally told him that he'd better get rid of this woman regardless of what it cost. All I know is that in 1927, he and his wife had probably the most celebrated and nastiest divorce in New York during that year. He did his best to regain the control of the stock and could not do so. And I've been told that between his wife, his lawyers, and the doctors, and the normal living expenses, that financially he got royally clobbered. One man told me that his wife pretty well cleaned him out. She did control, own, and run the magazine of Wall Street until a very few years ago when she sold it, and she became known during the 1930s and 1940s as the bitch of Wall Street. But that's another story. Meanwhile, Wyckoff eventually went to Europe, and in 1929 he was on the Riviera, recovering his health, and he saw what was happening to the New York market. He came back to the United States, tried to get some friends and clients out, former clients out, and of course they wouldn't believe him. So he went back again. By 1931, his health had recovered to the point where he could work a few hours a day, and so he founded our firm, which was originally Richard D. Wyckoff Incorporated. Later on, it became Wyckoff Associates Incorporated, later on Wyckoff Stock Market Institute, and is now just simply Stock Market Institute. Mr. Wyckoff did not want his knowledge to die with him, and therefore he set up our firm to teach the techniques that he had learned. As a result, we teach, and we do not advise, and we are still teaching Mr. Wyckoff's basic techniques with some modification and refinement. However, before going into Mr. Wyckoff's contribution, let me briefly finish his life story. Mr. Wyckoff was uniquely situated in the New York financial community. He was apparently almost the only one who was thoroughly conversant with stock market operations and who wanted to educate the general public how to operate in the market, and who had tested his own ideas with his own capital. Incidentally, Charles Dow never owned a share of stock in his life. However, Dow and Wyckoff had lunch every Wednesday afternoon. Wyckoff did set up our firm in 1931, and in the first year sold so many courses that it was not until some 40 years later that mark was finally equaled and surpassed in 1969 and 1970. Mr. Wyckoff married his third wife about 9 months before he died in 1934. I met her about 10 years or so ago, and she was then in her 70s and was still unusually attractive. And I remember her as being a lovely, gracious, warm person. I might mention two other people who were friends or associates of Mr. Wyckoff and who were not members of the staff. The first was Joseph Hirschhorn. In your course, Mr. Wyckoff writes that he had a young man who worked for him for 3 years, and that one day he told that young man that someday the knowledge that he was gaining would be worth $1 million to him. And approximately 15 years later, the man had $1 million. That was Joseph Hirschhorn, who eventually migrated to Canada and became known as the Uranium King, and has donated the Hirschhorn Sculpture Library to the Smithsonian Institution. Mr. Hirschhorn, in a Fortune magazine article in 1957, attributed the gaining of his fortune to the knowledge that he had learned from Mr. Wyckoff, and it was Mr. Hirschhorn who had urged Mr. Wyckoff to write down his knowledge, which resulted in the writing of our course. Now, the other person that I might mention is Edmund Tabell. During the early and middle 1960s, Walston and Company had one of the finest, if not the finest, technical research departments in the country. It was headed by Edmund Tabell, and Mr. Tabell had married Mr. Wyckoff's niece and knew Wyckoff quite well. Now, what about Mr. Wyckoff's contribution? As I see it, he had 4 basic contributions. The first contribution is volume studies. You see, Charles Dow stated something like this, that all the factors entering into the decisions to buy and sell is reflected in the price of the stock. And the Dow theory is erected on this. However, Mr. Wyckoff went beyond this. he realized it is not just the price, it is also the volume that is important, and is a reflection of the factors that go into the buying and selling. And Mr. Wyckoff's volume studies were years and decades ahead of his time, and he has been very widely copied in recent years. His second contribution is that he organized his knowledge into a three-step process. There are actually an additional step that he did not spell out. That is a fourth step. The three steps are, first of all, determine the trend of the market using a market index. Secondly, compare the individual stock. 4, comparative strength and weakness. 2, the market index. Thirdly, analyze the individual stocks to determine what stage of the market cycle it is in and if it is ready to move. Now, those are the three steps in Mr. Wyckoff's method, and they are spelled out in Section 9. That is the first sentence of Section 9. However, Mr. Wyckoff did have one additional step, and that was to wait until the market turned, and then take your position as the market turned or right after the market had turned. We are still basically teaching this approach with some modification simply because it is valid. Quite frankly, if there was anything better, I would use it. It's too bloody tough not to use the best. Now, Mr. Wyckoff went one step further, and that is that he disclosed his knowledge to the general public. And that comes to his third contribution, which, as I see it, is that he breached the tradition of secrecy. In the financial community, it had been the pros against the general public, and the pros did their best to operate in secret. I'm sure that just like all of you, the old-timers also kept notes, trying to define their knowledge and refine it, but they kept it to themselves, and Mr. Wyckoff was the only one of the old pros who disclosed his operating techniques and then left a teaching organization behind to continue teaching them to the general public. Incidentally, he apparently was not too well liked in certain circles, because he had disclosed those operating techniques and also because of the notoriety arising from the legal disputes and his divorce. Mr. Wyckoff had one other contribution. He mounted a campaign against the bucket shops and almost single-handedly put them out of business. I have seen a letter of appreciation written by the president of the New York Stock Exchange to Mr. Wyckoff for his contribution in that campaign. Now, Mr. Wyckoff died in 1934, and Mr. Robert Stanlaws obtained ownership and became president of the company. Bob Evans tells me that Stanlaws was an engineer by training, but his first love was the stock market, and that Mr. Stanlaws had worked with Mr. Wyckoff for many years and was one of the finest stock market analysts that the U.S. ever developed. However, he was also president of the company during a very difficult time, from 1934 to 1951, and during the 1930s and 40s, the stock exchange almost went out of business. There were days when they had 250,000 shares traded. One of the old-timers told me that he saw the football kicked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in the middle of the trading day. They didn't have anything else to do. And so Mr. Stanlaws held the organization together, perpetuated the knowledge, and made some extremely important contributions. Now, Mr. Wyckoff had an original one-volume text, and that was written in 1931. In 1932, he wrote the tape reading course. Now, in 1937, Mr. Stanlaws expanded Mr. Wyckoff's original one-volume text into a two-volume text, primarily using materials that he and Mr. Wyckoff had worked on prior to his death. along with some new material. Mr. Stanlaws was primarily responsible for the studies on vertical charts and the coordination of the vertical and figure charts. And this, of course, would include sections 16 and 17 of your text. It was also during his time that the trend barometer came into being. The trend barometer was invented by an excellent Wyckoff student named Toby Weary, and it was put into the hands of students in 1938. At that time, there were two indexes, the investment index, which was later renamed the force index, and the speculative index, which was later renamed the momentum index. In 1941, the technometer was added, and in 1951, Mr. Stanlaws died of a heart attack right at his desk. Mrs. Stanlaws eventually sold the company to Bob Evans, who had been the Midwest representative of Wyckoff. Bob Evans led the firm from 1951 to 1967. He purchased his course from Mr. Wyckoff in 1933 and got well acquainted with Mr. Wyckoff, and he knew Mr. Stanlaws quite well. In 1936, he became the Midwest representative for Wyckoff Associates, and at the time of Mr. Stanlaws' death, they had been corresponding back and forth by wire recorder and later on by tape recorder. And that was the inception of the recorded lecture program. Mr. Evans moved the firm from New York to the LaSalle Financial District in Chicago in 1951, and then in 1958 moved it out to Park Ridge. Bob Evans created the lecture program. He personally developed the optimism-pessimism index and a number of teaching analogies, such as the spring, the jump across the creek, the ice story, and after 5 years of working it out, he systematized the process of determining the counts and objectives by developing the count guide. When Bob Evans purchased the firm, it was almost ready to go out of existence, and when he moved it to Chicago, there were only 3 people on the staff, himself and 2 others. For over 10 years, Wyckoff Associates grew slowly by word-of-mouth advertising because he was unable to advertise. When he sold the business to Bud Andrews in 1967, it was quite a profitable company with 10 employees, and Mr. Evans has been quite successful as a market operator and as a businessman. The role and contribution of Bud Andrews is a bit more difficult to assess for 2 reasons. First of all, we do not have the perspective of time. His stewardship is comparatively recently. And secondly, he did own the company twice. He purchased it in 1967 and sold it to Alba Systems in 1972. A year later, in 1973, they sold it back to him, and in August 1974, as a result of the prior transactions, Alba reacquired ownership, and eventually, in November of 74, they sold the company to Mr. Freeman, Mr. A. Ray Freeman. During the mid-1960s, the operational climate was changing. Governmental regulations were becoming more and more stringent, particularly in the educational field. And one of the first things that Bud Andrews did was to revamp the Wyckoff course and improve the teaching. And in doing so, he expanded it into a 3-volume text with exams. He got us accredited with the National Home Study Council, which is the accrediting agency in our field. And we were, for the first time, registered with the SEC. Also, we came under the jurisdiction of the Veterans Administration, so that those students who qualified could have reimbursement under the GI Bill. If anything, we are over-regulated. Now, we went through a period of very rapid expansion in 1969 and 1970, and by 1972 we're retrenching. This led directly to the sale of the firm to Elba the first time, and during the next 2 or 3 years we went through considerable retrenchment and reorganization, part of which was directed by Bud Andrews, Bob Baker, myself, and Ray Freeman. Ray Freeman got his course around 1966 or 67, worked for Bud Andrews, left, and eventually purchased the company and has opened a Phoenix office since his home is in Phoenix, Arizona. He is handling the advertising and sales from that office, and also is heavily involved in computer development, putting many of our operations on computer. I am primarily responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Park Ridge office, without getting into the accounting or financial end of it. And I am heavily involved in the education area and make the trading techniques lectures. Incidentally, I was responsible for replacing Mr. Evans's old introductory lectures with the newer basic lectures, which presented many of the newer developments, re-emphasizes such principles as the spring, sign of strength, and last point of support, and so forth, and which help to tie together the various principles presented in the course and the basic lectures. Now, a number of students had asked me how they can go back to using exactly what Mr. Wyckoff used since he was so successful. They wanted to go back to original Wyckoff. My answer has to be that it is basically impossible. I have checked this understanding of how he actually operated with several sources. When he did his best work, he was heavily involved with other things. Therefore, he actually had someone else keep his charts. And I do not believe that Mr. Hirschhorn was the only one. There is evidence to the contrary. He used the New York Times average to determine the longer-term trend of the market, and he kept track of 150 to 200 stocks on a figure chart basis daily. He also apparently used some vertical charts. However, he primarily relied on his tape-reading ability to determine whether or not he was going to go into a stock. What he was primarily interested in, apparently, was a stock that had a very large count and was beginning to move, or was on the springboard, and therefore was ready to move. And he used his tape-reading ability to see whether or not the stock was beginning to move. Why? Because he wanted to get into a stock that was ready to start a trend or to resume a trend, but which had a very large potential move that could work out on the basis of the one-point figure chart. And Mr. Wyckoff was an excellent tape reader. Now, relatively few students are in a position to do tape reading as a full-time occupation. Most of us have other work that ties us up 8, 10, 12 hours a day. Therefore, Mr. Wyckoff set up the basic course to account for that, and that you determine the trend of the market from a market index, and that you compare the vertical chart of the individual stock with a market index for comparative strength and weakness, and thirdly, that you carefully analyze the vertical and figure chart of the individual stock, and that you use the vertical chart of the individual stock to determine whether or not the stock itself is beginning to move. And this is an important change. We're using the vertical chart to determine whether or not it's beginning to move, and Mr. Wyckoff apparently used his tape reading. Now, for those who do have sufficient capital or income to warrant using tape reading, we still have the tape reading course, but it is my personal opinion that you would still be better off operating for the intermediate to major trend and use your chart reading of the vertical and figure chart of the individual stock. Incidentally, the New York Times average is apparently not being calculated anymore. At one time it was known and printed in the Chicago papers as the Chicago Tribune average, and that average disappeared from the Tribune some years ago. Now, Mr. Wyckoff's one-volume text was primarily devoted to a charting setup and to a figure chart, along with position sheets. And I asked Mr. Evans one time why Mr. Stanlaws expanded it into a two-volume text, and why he added the vertical line studies. Mr. Evans said that Mr. Stanlaws did this because so many students had lost money using figure charts only, and using the one-volume text only. They needed the vertical charts to determine the direction and the timing of the move, since there were very few students who could operate with figure charts only, and who were good tape readers or who were in a tape reading situation. Now, Mr. Evans placed very heavy emphasis on individual stock analysis, the analysis of the vertical and figure chart, and did not tie in the action of the individual stock with the Wyckoff wave too rigidly. For instance, if the stock had a very large, tight count, a compact count, and then it had a spring, he would buy on the spring, provided the general market was not in the middle or in the early stages of an extended reaction. As long as the Wyckoff wave was somewhat neutral or was moving up, he would still go in and buy on the spring. As a result, the students who studied under him became very good in analyzing a vertical and figure chart of an individual stock. Now, later on, Bud Andrews tied all of the market operations in closely with the Wyckoff wave, with a turn in the Wyckoff wave and the direction of the market, the trend of the market. He de-emphasized vertical chart analysis compared to Bob Evans. As I see it, Mr. Evans's emphasis is admirably suited to intermediate to major trend trading, the longer-term trend. Bud Andrews was quite short-term, and his approach or emphasis is excellently suited for quick trading, and he still uses it in his floor trading on the CBOE. I think the best approach is somewhere in between, and have been attempting on these lectures to aid you to strengthen your ability to analyze the vertical and figure charts of the individual stock. I'll say so long.